Electrochemical cells are what allow batteries to generate electricity, but what's going on inside of them isn't always that obvious. In this video, I'm going to break down how electrochemical cells work step by step. So what are electrochemical cells? Well, you'll probably remember from GCSE looking at cells and batteries, and here we've got the circuit symbols for those, batteries just being many cells joined together in series. And you'll also recall the idea that if you place a cell or a battery into an electrical circuit, it provides a potential difference that is going to cause a current to flow. And when we're thinking about an electric current, it's simply a flow of charged particles. Now, often we think about that in terms of electrons, usually because our conducting material is going to be metals with their delocalized electrons that are free to flow, but any charged particle will do. So it could be positive ions, negative ions. As long as you've got a flow of charged particles, you would have an electric current. Now, when you place cells or batteries into a circuit, those electrons will flow from the negative terminal round through the circuit to the positive terminal. And those electrons are being generated or produced by a chemical reaction that takes place at the negative terminal. And because that reaction is causing a species or a substance to lose electrons, it's an oxidation reaction. Okay, so think about oil rig. Oxidation is loss of electrons, reduction is gain of electrons. And those electrons will flow through the circuit round to the positive electrode, where another chemical reaction will occur where those electrons are being used up. And they're being used to reduce a substance, to reduce a species, i.e. they are gaining electrons. So when we're thinking about electrochemical cells, which is just the full name for a cell that you're already familiar with from GCSE, the key thing for us to bear in mind is that electrochemical cells work by carrying out redox reactions, so reduction and oxidation occurring at the same time, which ultimately produces a flow of electrons, and that is our electric current. So let's take a bit of a closer look at exactly how it is this works inside of a cell. So here we have a simple electrochemical cell, which is made up of two half cells that are joined and connected together. So on the left-hand side, I've got one of my half cells. This one is our negative electrode, and that is joined to our other half cell on the right-hand side, which is going to be our positive electrode. Now, each half cell contains a substance that is undergoing a chemical reaction. At our negative electrode, that chemical reaction is causing a species to lose electrons, and so therefore we've got oxidation that is occurring. At our other half cell, the positive electrode, we've got chemical reactions that involve the gain of electrons, so we're reducing a species. So we can see already we've got our redox reaction, reduction and oxidation occurring at the same time. Now, since these two half cells are connected, electrons can flow from our negative electrode, where we're having our oxidation reactions, round through the circuit to our positive electrode, which is undergoing a reduction reaction. And this flow of electrons ultimately is our electric current, which would ultimately allow that bulb to light up. But what's actually going on at each of our half cells, causing one to lose electrons and the other to gain them? In order to answer that question, we need to look at half cells in a little bit more detail. So here we've got a half cell of zinc, and we can see in this particular half cell for zinc, we've got a piece of zinc metal that is being dipped into a solution containing zinc ions. And a half cell can essentially be created by taking any metal and dipping it into a solution that contains its ions. Now, when we do this, we actually end up establishing a reversible reaction. And that reversible reaction is between the metal atoms being oxidized, turning into metal ions and giving out their electrons. And the opposite reaction is whereby we have those metal ions being reduced, so gaining electrons and turning back into those metal atoms. Now, because this reaction is reversible, we are going to end up establishing an equilibrium. An equilibrium whereby the rate of the oxidation reaction, the atoms turning into ions and losing electrons, is going to be equal to the rate of the reduction reaction, those metal ions gaining electrons and turning back into atoms. Now, why is this important? Well, for different metals, the position of that equilibrium is going to lie in slightly different places. Now, we know that different metals have different reactivities. And if we start thinking about why it is that some metals are more or less reactive than others, it all comes down to how easy it is for that metal to lose electrons. So if we now think about this reversible reaction and the position of the equilibrium, the more reactive a metal is, the easier it is for it to lose electrons, i.e. the easier it is for it to be oxidized, and so the position of the equilibrium is actually going to lie slightly more towards the side with those ions and electrons. Whereas if we had a less reactive metal, one that doesn't lose electrons as easily, it's not as easily oxidized, then the position of that equilibrium is actually going to lie slightly further towards the side with the metal atoms. If we then think about our zinc half cell, which we've got on the screen, we've got our reversible reaction. Okay, we've got our zinc atoms, which can be oxidized to form our zinc 2+ ions and giving out 2 electrons. And then we've got our reverse reaction, as is represented here, our reduction reaction, where those zinc ions are gaining electrons to turn back into zinc atoms. Now, we know that zinc is a fairly reactive metal, and so therefore the position of that equilibrium is actually going to lie slightly towards the side with our zinc ions and also therefore our electrons. Now, why is that important? Well, because it's lying slightly further towards the right-hand side and we've got more of those electrons, it actually creates a greater or more negative electric potential. But what is an electric potential, and why is it important? Well, the term electric potential describes how strongly a half cell can push electrons away. If we take our zinc half cell, we've already said that the position of the equilibrium lies further towards the side with the ions and electrons, and that this leads to a greater or more negative electric potential, i.e. it leads to a situation where the half cell is trying to push electrons away more. But why is that the case? Well, the more the equilibrium lies to the side with our ions and electrons, the greater the buildup of electrons at our electrode within our half cell. Now, the buildup of electrons ends up creating electrostatic repulsion. We know that electrons are negatively charged and that like charges are going to repel one another. So the more electrons there are in our half cell, the greater the repulsion, the greater or more negative the electric potential becomes. Now, if we compare this to a copper half cell, we know that copper is less reactive than zinc. And therefore, as a comparison, the position of our equilibrium is going to lie more towards the side with our copper atoms, i.e. there will be fewer electrons building up our electrode, fewer electrons within our half cell. Because there are fewer electrons, there is going to be a weaker electrostatic repulsion, which means that we're going to have a lower or less negative electric potential, i.e. the half cell has a less ability to push electrons away from it. So the key takeaway from this is that the electric potential is lower or less negative for less reactive metals. And when we describe the potential as being less negative, we could also argue that that means it is more positive. So electric potential is lower, less negative, or more positive for our less reactive metals, and electric potential is greater or more negative for more reactive metals because of the position of our equilibrium. For us to fully understand how these reactions in each half cell is going to cause our flow of electrons, we need to look at piecing them together to build a full cell. So here I have my 2 half cells, my zinc half cell and my copper half cell, combined together by an external circuit flowing through a light bulb. So what happens when we connect these two half cells together? Well, on the left-hand side, I've got my zinc electrode. We know that zinc is more reactive than what copper is. As a consequence to that, the position of our equilibrium is going to lie further towards the side with our zinc ions and electrons, which means we're going to get a greater buildup of electrons inside of our half cell, which is going to make that half cell more negatively charged. As a consequence to that greater buildup of electrons, we're going to have a greater or more negative electric potential, which means that that zinc half cell is pushing the electrons away from it more so than what our copper half cell is. Our zinc electrode is going to become our negative electrode. Ultimately, it's where our oxidation is going to occur and where those electrons are going to move from. If we then think about our copper half cell, our copper electrode on the right-hand side, we know that copper is less reactive than zinc. The position of the equilibrium is going to lie further towards the side with our copper atoms, which is going to result in a lower buildup of electrons within that half cell. As a consequence to that, we could say that our copper half cell is going to be less negatively charged, or we could even turn and say it means it's more positively charged. As a consequence to having fewer electrons, we're going to have a lower electric potential. In other words, that electric potential will be more positive. It's not pushing electrons away from it as strongly as what the zinc half cell is. That means that our copper electrode is going to become our positive electrode. And when we've connected our two half cells together, the electrons are going to flow from our negative electrode, the zinc half cell, around through this external circuit to our positive electrode, to our copper electrode. Why? Because that zinc half cell has a greater electric potential. It's pushing the electrons away from it more so than what copper is. Our electrons are going to flow from our negative zinc electrode round to our positive copper electrode, which is producing our electric current. Now, the key thing we need to bear in mind is that the electron flow is caused by the difference in electric potential of our two half cells. The reason why our electrons flow from one half cell to another is because one of our half cells has a greater or more negative electric potential than the other. But what happens when our electrons do leave our zinc half cell and flow round and arrive at our copper half cell? So this is where Le Chatelier's principle really kicks into action. At our negative electrode, we are losing electrons, and as that happens, the concentration of electrons within the half cell decreases. Due to Le Chatelier's principle, the system is going to try to oppose that change, and it's going to favour the reaction where our metal atoms are oxidized, turning into metal ions, but crucially releasing more of those electrons to try to increase that concentration of electrons. At our positive electrode, we are gaining electrons, which means that the concentration of electrons is going to increase. Again, the system is going to try to oppose that change and will favour the reaction where the ions are gaining electrons, being reduced, to turn back into metal atoms. So at our negative electrode, we've got our oxidation reaction occurring predominantly, whereas at our positive electrode, we have got our reduction reaction that is being favoured. And therefore, our electrons can continue to flow along the wire from the negative electrode to the positive electrode, maintaining our electrical current. And the crucial thing is that it is the reversible reactions in each half cell that maintain this difference in electrical potential. However, we do have a problem. Our circuit inside of our cell isn't actually yet complete, and current cannot flow in incomplete circuits. To finalize our cell, we need a salt bridge. Salt bridges are just glass U-shaped tubes that are filled with a solution of a soluble ionic compound. They can also just be filter paper that's been soaked in the ionic compound too. And salt bridges complete our circuit by allowing ions to move between the half cells. And it's really important we recognise that it's by allowing ions to move between the half cells, not electrons. No electrons flow through the salt bridge. Salt bridges also help prevent charge from building up in our two half cells, but we'll look at exactly how salt bridges work, what they're made from and why in more detail in a separate video. And that's the fundamentals of electrochemical cells and how they generate an electrical current. In the next video, we're going to look at how electrode potentials are measured using the standard hydrogen electrode. And if you want to go further, the full topic is in the playlist on screen.